this position, it's white to move. What would you play? Okay, the bishop is attacked on c4, so the obvious choices are either bishop b3 or bishop d3. Bishop d3 is the correct choice. If you play bishop b3, then there's knight takes e4 with the discovery on the bishop. Now, if you try to take the bishop, then of course knight takes d2 is not working, the queen's hit. Bishop d3 addresses this threat because after knight takes e4, we got queen takes e4 and checkmate is threatened. So there's no capturing the bishop on g5. So this tactic would not work for black. In this position, it's white to move. What would you play? Okay, h3 is really necessary here. You don't want black to get his bishop to g4. This would just be way too uncomfortable. Let's say instead you played like queen d2, bishop g4. Okay, now the threat is bishop takes knight, and then we got to recapture with the pawn. That would weaken the king. That's not going to be any good. So here you would probably just have to either move the knight backwards or maybe move the bishop backwards to defend the knight. None of this is ideal. Rook e1 was played in the game, and bishop g4. How are you going to deal with this pawn being captured after bishop takes, queen recaptures? Again, we don't want to capture with the pawn. You could push it forward, but then knight c e5 is bad. More pressure on that pinned knight. So it's best to just avoid all this and play h3 right away. Here it's black to move. What would you play? So obviously we need to capture the knight on d4, so the question is bishop takes knight or pawn takes knight. Turns out c takes d4 is the best move. The knight is attacked on c3, it must move, and then black wants to play f5. We want to fix this pawn on f4 so this bishop can't get active so easily. Contrast that with bishop takes d4, and now white can play f5. This is a different story. He can move the bishop here and target d6 in a minute. You know, you can't win this pawn on f5 because takes, bishop takes, rook takes. You've lost the bishop since this pawn's pinned. So if you try to like develop or something, he's got knight e4, hitting the d6 pawn. You could do this, hit the queen, but then bishop f4. White's got the initiative here. His pieces are well placed. The king is weak. So white to move, what would you play? Okay, a3 is really necessary here. You don't want black to play a3 and then fix this weak pawn on the a2 square. So let's say you play queen c2, attacking this pawn. Black gets a3. Now, let's say we make some passing move. Queen b2 is coming. Alright, so unless you want to lose this pawn on a2, you got to take. And then it looks like you might be able to defend with bishop b1, but then just bishop f5. And you're either going to lose your bishop or you're going to have to capture, and then you can't stop this pawn. Alright, so maybe back here you want to try g4 to keep that bishop from going to that square there. But now there's a tactic. Bishop takes a2. And if the queen takes, now we got queen h2 check. You lost your queen. So it's best to just play a3. Fix that pawn so a3 is not played by black. Here it's white to move. What would you play? So you can see black is attacking two pawns. Pawn on d4, pawn on b2. So you could simultaneously defend both pawns with this backwards move, bishop c1, but that's not very active. The best move is going to be queen to e2, and we're going to let black take either of those pawns. The point of this move is that there's protection on the bishop, and we're ready to castle on the queen side. So let's first look at queen takes b2. We got rook b1, queen a3, and we can just regain the pawn immediately with rook takes b7 if we want, but that might not even be the best move. Maybe something like g5 and then the knight moves. White is ahead in development here. You can even play d5 here. This pawn here is pinned. So that's not great for black. Let's look at queen takes d4. Since the bishop's protected, white can castle on the queen side, you know, threatening some kind of discovery on the black queen. If the queen moves, we have these ideas of sacrificing on e6 for two pawns, you know, queen takes e6, and then the bishop can block like that, and we're just going to increase pressure on that bishop, try to win that bishop. The queen can defend. We'll come in here with the knight. Now, if knight takes, then rook takes, and then we're just on our way to putting a third piece on that bishop. So that's not probably best for black, but anything black does here is losing. Knight to d5. We got knight d6, check. You know, the king moves. We have a fork like this. White just has an overwhelming advantage in all these lines. White to move, what would you play? Best move here is e5, which might not look great on the surface because it gives black this nice square d5 for his knight. But if he plays that, now we got queen h5, threatening mate on h7. You can't play h6 or else taking like so. Black will have to give up material to avoid getting checkmated. Have to play something like f5, and then we got this check. King goes here, knight to h5, and he's going to either have to put a bishop here or sack his rook, something like that. So that's not working. Back here he really needs to play g6, and once g6 is played, we can take this bishop here. Queen takes e7. Now queen h6, and this knight can't really do a lot from the square, even though it looks kind of nice. And the black king's weak. The knight is looking to maybe hop in this way. Maybe a rook will get involved with some mate threats. Back here, if knight takes instead, that's fine. Queen to g5 here. And if the knight moves, queen to h6, we don't want to trade queens. White's better in all these positions. The king is very weak. White to move. What would you play? Strongest move here is rook to b3. We're protecting c3 so that we have the threat of bishop d3, which would trap the black queen. So black needs to do something about that. First, let's look at queen to f5, offering a queen trade. Attacking the bishop on g5, we just go queen to e3, protecting the bishop. And again, bishop d3 is threatened, so black needs to play something like f6 or h6, attacking the bishop, so queen takes g5 is possible. Here, we'll just go ahead and take on f6, trade down on f6 like this, and then we can attack the queen with a rook. This pawn here is weak, so after the queen moves and takes, you got to take with the king so you don't lose this pawn here. But then queen e5, the queen's in a commanding position, threatening to come in here maybe. This is looking really bad. Black's behind in development. So let's look back here at the other move. First, let's look at here h6. Here we'll just go bishop to e7, hitting the rook and also threatening bishop d3. So that's not really working. And then finally, let's look at this move, queen to e4. Queen takes queen, pawn takes. A weak pawn right here, and white can go a4, attacking like this. If black takes, now black's behind in development. If this knight moves, this pawn's going to fall, or maybe even rook b7 is better. So yeah, white's much better in these lines. Black to move, what would you play? Here black's a little bit tied up. He can't move this bishop off c8 or else he loses the b pawn. So the best way to deal with this is actually to play knight d7, and then we're going to go to c5. Okay, we're also threatening this pawn here on e5, so black needs to defend. We'll go c5, and if the bishop tries to stay on this diagonal by bishop f3, then we can hop into d3 here, hitting the bishop, hitting this pawn. So this is very nice for black. And if bishop c2, then we can just play b6, and we're going to get our bishop going. Let's look at some alternatives that don't really work. If you try bishop d7, obviously you just lose the pawn. If you try rook b8, now you got bishop e3, and if this knight moves, you're going to lose this pawn now. This is all very uncomfortable for black, so best move is to go knight d7 and then go to c5. In this position, it's black to move. What would you play? The only move to draw here is rook to h2. You need to go after that h pawn with the rook. If instead you try rook to d5, going after the f pawn, rook takes c2 is going to lose for black. Okay, so you got two options for taking the f pawn. If you take with the rook, then rook f2 forces a trade of rooks, and white just has a winning position. Rook takes king takes on e6, but then h5, the king has to run over here and catch the pawn, and he's just not quick enough to get back. This is a lost position for black. You know, he's not going to be able to stop the pawn. If instead king takes, we got e7. Okay, so rook to e5 check is really necessary. King to d3. If you take on e7, we got rook c5 check, and this pawn here is going to fall. If you go rook to e5, then just takes. The king comes over here, and again, this is a lost position, similar to what we saw before. Alternatively, right here, if you go king g4 and just let him have that pawn like that, you can take here, but then this pawn starts to move, and the king's just way too far away to help stop this pawn black's going to lose. Now let's look at the correct move, rook to h2, king to d3, going after this pawn. Rook takes h4, rook takes, king takes f5, e7, we got rook h8. The rook can try to get behind the pawn, but we go rook to e8, king c4, coming in after this pawn, king f6, king b5, he goes after this pawn, we grab this pawn, takes, king takes a5, and see in this position the king's close enough, this is going to draw. He's going to go like this and get in front. And then finally, back here, rook to e2, let's say you don't advance the pawn, you just get the rook behind it. We'll do the same thing, we'll get the rook back here, king d4, king f6. He can come in like this and protect the pawn with this king, but we'll put our king right in front of the pawn. Rook f2, trying to come in to f7. We'll go rook h5, check, and drive the king away from the pawn. Okay, and once he moves, then we could take like this. So white doesn't have any way to win in those lines after rook to h2, the correct move. Here it's black to move. What would you play? Okay, the correct defense here is queen to c6. Hopefully you saw the threat, queen to d8, and then the bishop falls. But more importantly, there's a mate threat. And queen to c6 is the way to defend the bishop because it guards e8. That's important, as we're going to see in a minute. You know, queen d8 can be played, and now king f7 is just a totally safe move. Contrast that to the alternative, bishop to b7, queen d8 check, king goes to f8. Now we got queen to f8 check, king g6, it's the only square. Now queen to e8 check is a big problem, which wouldn't be possible if the queen was on c6. The king goes to g5. If king h6, this is not any good. It just runs into bishop f4 check. And then you got to play this. And if bishop goes here, threatening mate this way, coming to f8, you know, queen d1, there's just, you know, black has a few moves to stall mate, but he doesn't have any good way to prevent it. So king g5 is best. And then we got h4 check, king takes. Now the killer move here is queen to f7. Simply threatening to take out the g7 pawn, and black doesn't have a good way to prevent that. The queen's still tied down to defending this bishop on b7. Let's say bishop c6, just getting the bishop out of danger so the queen maybe can do something over here to help stop the mate threats. You got queen takes g7. Now the queen can go over here. The problem with the queen here on g7 is that there was a couple different mates threatened. There was a queen h6 as well as queen g4. So this looks like it might address both of these. It stops the queen to g4 mate, and then after queen h6 you got queen h5, but then g3 check, and there's no way for the king to continue to guard the queen, and it's going to be mate in one move. Mate. Like so.